The Fox and the Henhouse, the West, China, and the Cost of Global Hubris. A Flint West monologue. This is the story of the cleanest sentence in economics and the messiest reality in politics. One country's output is another country's input. That's the whole magic trick. That's the cathedral. That's globalization in one line. And for a while, it worked like scripture. Country A makes the cheap parts. Country B assembles the mid-tier goods. Country C designs the high-margin brand story. And everybody pretends the value was created by the last guy who touched the product. That's comparative advantage. That's supply chains. That's the world turning into one big factory with borders acting like decorative fences. But here's the punchline. The cathedral was never built on trust. It was built on incentives. And incentives don't stay loyal when the power balance changes. Section 1. The load-bearing insight. One country's output is another country's input. Meaning, the global economy is a relay race. If one runner trips, everybody eats asphalt. And it created a shared assumption. We can depend on each other because we all benefit. That assumption is now dying in real time. Not because humans became mean overnight, but because the system reached the point where mutual dependence started feeling like mutual hostage-taking. Section 2. The structural landscape. 1. The original deal. The world exports. America absorbs. Here's the part most people miss. The global system wasn't just free trade. It was a special arrangement. America's role wasn't simply to make things. America's role was to be the consumer of last resort, the buyer who never stops buying. And the hidden return gift was this. Exporters sent their surplus back into United States treasuries. So America imported goods and imported cheap capital. That cheap capital kept United States borrowing costs low, kept the financial system inflated, kept the party going. It wasn't only trade. It was trade and capital recycling. That's why the United States could run persistent deficits and still look like the adult in the room. Because the world treated treasuries like the global savings account. 2. Why trade balance matters to a nation-state's internal engine. Now we hit something mechanical, not ideological. When a country is roughly balanced, it imports inputs, turns them into higher value output, creates domestic jobs, generates domestic tax revenue, and sustains domestic political stability. But when a country runs a deep, persistent deficit, it looks like this. You're importing the inputs, but you're not transforming enough of them into domestic value creation. So you don't just lose money. You lose employment capacity, industrial competence, wage power, tax base, social cohesion, and political patience. In plain terms, you start bleeding your own economy into someone else's factory floor. So when countries slap tariffs up, it's not only protectionism, it's panic. It's government saying, if we don't defend the value creation loop, we lose the ability to employ and tax our own people. That's not a trade debate. That's a sovereignty debate. 3. The electric vehicle moment, when inputs became existential. Now enter electric vehicles. Electric vehicles aren't just cars. Electric vehicles are manufacturing jobs, supply chain leverage, battery dominance, industrial robotics, national energy strategy, export identity, middle-class wages, and the tax base wearing a metal jacket. Europe cannot casually lose autos. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Scandinavia. Cars are not a product. Cars are a pillar. So when China can deliver electric vehicles that are more advanced, cheaper, at scale, and with extreme cost advantages, that's not competition. That's a flood. So tariffs become a dam. And yes, tariffs are self-defeating in a pure comparative advantage model. But governments aren't optimizing for textbook elegance. Governments optimize for employment, stability, strategic industries, and political survival. That's why the global supply chain consensus begins to crack. Because the moment the inputs become existential, countries stop playing cooperative economics and start playing defensive politics. 4. No one can compete with China, the energy spine. This is the part that makes everyone uncomfortable. China's advantage isn't only labor anymore. It's energy, scale, and coordination, cheap, abundant electricity, massive industrial clusters, state-linked planning, long-time horizons. So even if the West says compete, the honest questions become, compete with what? Compete how? Compete under which cost structure? Compete with which energy policy? So the West reaches for the lever it still controls. Sanctions, export controls, tariffs, industrial policy, alliances, financial pressure. That's not capitalism. That's geopolitics wearing a suit. Section 3. When did it start? Here is the real question. Not what happened, but when did the unraveling begin? Because many people point to 2022, Russia, Ukraine, SWIFT, frozen reserves, and say that's the start. But that is a symptom. The unraveling started when the system stopped being unipolar in practice, even if it remained unipolar in branding. So here are the narrative acts. Act 1, the invitation, letting the fox into the henhouse. Some experts pin it to a famous hinge, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, because the West made a bet. The bet was simple. We'll offshore the low end. We'll keep the high end. China will liberalize. China will become a stakeholder. China will open markets the way we do. We'll get rich together, and the rules won't be challenged. So the West chased cheaper goods, higher corporate margins, lower inflation via imports, a consumption boom, financialization, and the political comfort of pretending industry didn't matter anymore. And for a while, the fox stayed small. It made socks, then phones, then screens, then components, then assembly lines. The West smiled because the shelves were stocked and the consumer price index looked polite. But then the fox got smarter. Act 2, the climb, from low-end workshop to high-end predator. Here's the twist the West didn't respect enough. China wasn't trying to remain a workshop. China was trying to become a civilization-scale producer. So it climbed. High-speed rail, power grids, ports, batteries, solar manufacturing, machine tools, chips, eventually, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, nuclear technology, advanced industrial supply chains. And that's the moment the story flips. Because once China starts competing in the high-value layer, it's no longer one country's output is another's input. It becomes one country's output is another's unemployment. And that triggers the backlash. Act 3, the response, protect the henhouse. So the West reacts like any incumbent power. Tariffs, restrictions, friendshoring, de-risking, technology controls, especially high-end chips, strategic industrial policy, alliances, narrative warfare. They're cheating. Now, some of that may be true, but the deeper truth is simpler. The West finally realized the system it built could produce a rival strong enough to rewrite the rules. So the West tries to freeze the game board. And China reads the signal clearly. We are not a future partner. We are a present threat. So China counters. Domestic substitution, local alternatives, energy and materials control, trade redirection, belt and road style connectivity, and, critically, reserve diversification. Act 4, the financial weaponization moment. Then comes the catalytic moment. Russia's reserves are frozen. Russia is pushed out of the SWIFT system. Whether framed as justified or not, the signal to every government on Earth is unmistakable. Your so-called risk-free savings are only risk-free if you remain politically aligned. That's when United States treasuries stop being pure savings and become conditional savings. And once that happens, the capital recycling loop weakens. Countries start looking at gold like it's not a barbarous relic. They start stacking metal like they're living through an empire shift. Central banks accumulate gold. Silver demand rises, including from countries like India. The deeper point is simple. The world starts saving outside the United States ledger. And that is not just finance. That is a vote against dependence. Act 5, the United States consequence. The input gets curtailed. Now we get back to the original line. One country's output is another country's input. America's input wasn't just cheap goods. It was cheap capital. If exporters no longer recycle surplus into United States treasuries the way they once did, then the consequences follow. Long end yields remain elevated. The cost of capital rises. Mortgage rates clamp down. Housing activity freezes. Business investment becomes more selective. Everything leveraged starts to squeal. So the environment emerges clearly. A stagnant feeling economy, a housing market grinding down, a high cost of borrowing, and a strange reality where headline growth is carried by a concentrated set of giant firms. A top-heavy market, a top-heavy economy. That is what it looks like when capital is expensive, risk is repriced, and the old demand engine can no longer run on yesterday's fuel. Section 4. The story arc that hits human psychology. This is where the movie framing locks in. The arc is simple and timeless. Hubris leads to unintended consequences, which then accelerate decline. The West built a system to extract short-term gains, outsource the mess, keep the margins, keep the branding, keep the high-end layer. It believed it could manage the hierarchy permanently. But the system did not just create efficiency, it created capability elsewhere. And when that capability matured, the West responded defensively, and the defense itself accelerated fragmentation. That is the poetic turn. Because the tariffs and barriers are not restoring the old consensus. They are confirming its death. So the moral is not China bad or West bad. The moral is this: when you build a world order around your own advantage, you eventually meet the bill. Because the world learns the rules too. That is cinematic justice, not cartoon justice, structural justice, the kind where the villain is not a person, but a mindset. We can design the game so only we win. And the ending is clear. The game evolves, the fox adapts, the henhouse locks its doors. And the supply chains, once the bloodstream of the global economy, begin clotting into blocks. A Flint West closing. The old world ran on a simple spell. Interdependence will keep us peaceful. The new world runs on a harsher one. Dependence is vulnerability. And that is why the consensus is fraying. Because the global economy was never just a marketplace. It was a pact. And now, everyone is rewriting the terms. Flint West, reporting from the macro frontier.